One day in 2023, I was reading World Religions in 30 Seconds, and suddenly my brain decided it was all made up. Christianity, God, faith, the Bible. I thought everything I had been taught was a myth, something created to make people feel better, but completely detached from the observable universe. After all, I had never been able to find answers from any of my pastors or Christian friends that reconciled science with what the Bible taught. So for the next 10 months, I wrestled. My heart still wanted to believe in God, but my mind kept insisting there's no evidence. There's no reason to trust any of it. Where's the proof? I felt like my faith was completely unraveling. And it wasn't until I started facing my doubts, like really facing them, like really pursuing answers and digging into the hard questions, that I finally started to find what I was looking for. So that journey is what led me to pursue a master's degree in Christian apologetics. So if you've ever felt like your questions are too big, too dangerous, too shameful, too guilty to bring to God, you're not alone. When we acknowledge and address our doubts early, doubt is not a threat to faith. It's often an invitation to deepen it, and it might even be the first sign that your faith is becoming really real. I'm thrilled you're here with us on the Christian Clinician, where we join faith with evidence-based medicine to revitalize your health and renew your faith. Get ready for real and informative conversations with wellness experts and Christian scholars alike to gain a deeper understanding of our faith, explore our God-given purpose, and discover how the strength of our relationship with God can impact our health here on earth. Welcome to the Christian Clinician. I'm your host, Tanya Paynter, and in today's episode, we're having an honest conversation about something pretty much every Christian will face at some point: doubts. Whether your questions are theological, emotional, born from painful experiences, whatever it is, ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. In fact, unresolved doubt can quietly unravel your faith until it even affects your physical health. But here's the good news. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why doubt is not something to be ashamed of, and that it can actually be the catalyst for a deeper, stronger faith. You'll learn how unaddressed spiritual unrest can show up in your physical body, and you'll walk away with a clearer way to understand your doubts and to begin the process of addressing them without fear, shame, or guilt. So I want to share with you how I came to be so interested in our doubts and our religious struggles. So as I shared in the intro, in 2023, I just hit this wall. I had been going to church. I've called myself a Christian my entire life. And I was sitting there reading this book that I got from Barnes and Nobles called World Religions in 30 Seconds. And each page had basically the major tenets of each religion, their religious texts, and their major teachings. And I was reading through it, and something just flipped in my brain. And I said, wow, this is all made up. Like, these are all just a bunch of stories. They're different for every culture. Christianity is probably no more true than anything else because I've never been able to reconcile my own doubts. Nobody's ever been able to answer the questions that I had growing up. And so I basically said, since there's no evidence, I'm just going to, I don't know what I'm going to do, but this is ridiculous. The problem is, or maybe my savior, is that my heart still held on to God. My heart really wanted to hold on to him, but my brain kept telling me that this was a bunch of nonsense and I just needed to let go. So I spent 10 months praying and battling. I still went to church. I still did all the things. In fact, I don't think pretty much anybody really knew that I was going through this existential crisis of mine. And that is its own problem, which we will talk about in a future episode this season about fellowship and involving other people in our struggles. But I also felt the shame and the guilt. And like, if I call myself a Christian, how can I have these kinds of thoughts? And I didn't think that anybody would understand them. And I felt very alone. And all through my life, when I had had doubts about, well, is it evolution or is it creation? And I would talk to my pastors and my Christian friends, and they'd say, well, obviously it's creation through the Bible, because the Bible tells us that. And I was like, but look at the evolution information that we have. Like, how do we reconcile the two? Well, science doesn't explain everything. So you just have to trust the Bible is right and have faith and just like pray that God will show you the truth. And I was like, okay, well, thanks, but that's not really helpful for these questions that I'm having. Like, I need to get some answers. I need to reconcile these questions that I have with my faith. Then I'd go to my professors, which was definitely not a good idea from a religious standpoint, and ask them,
how does this fit into the greater picture of a, religion and things like that? And well, religion's just a bunch of made up nonsense. Like you can believe those stories if you want, but they're for kids. Basically, we have what we need through science here. And if you're going to be a true scientist, like you need to leave that stuff alone and focus on the data that we have. So those were always the answers that I had growing up. And I knew in my heart that there had to be a reconciliation. If God was actually true, then science and religion would fit very nicely together because if God created creation, then he couldn't have created something that would disprove himself. So this was the battle that I struggled with my entire life. I never got any answers. Nothing ever seemed to resolve. So over that 10-month period in 2023, I prayed, I did my worship, I did routine. Nothing seemed to pull me out of it. So I started to try to do my own research and started searching online for non-biblical evidence. If I was going to try to understand the truth of Christianity, I needed to know what proof outside of the Bible do we have to show that Jesus, the resurrection, Christianity, the flood, like all of it, what evidence do we have to support that? And so I remember praying one night in bed. I was exhausted from this battle. I couldn't battle. My heart and my mind could not continue to battle. So I prayed a prayer of desperation. I said, God, if you are real, if I am supposed to continue following you, I need you to deliver me from this battle because I'm exhausted. I don't have the strength to fight this anymore. And I want more than anything to follow you, but my brain just says no. And so you need to deliver me from this. And wouldn't you know, I woke up the next morning, all my doubts were gone. Well, I should say I still had questions, but my doubts were gone. My faith was rock solid. And from that moment to this, I have not had another waver in faith. And like that was its own proof, right? God had answered my question. He had stepped in. He had taken care of that major doubt, that faith. He knew that I had reached my limit and he delivered me from that when I asked. But that was just such a motivator to say, all right, God is true. Therefore, I know that there are answers to these questions and I'm going to find them. And that was the beginning of me searching for these answers. I continued that search for the non biblical evidence, found a whole lot of it. And within a week of that prayer, I had ordered a couple of apologetics books. So I didn't know anything about apologetics. I'd never heard of the term before. And if you haven't, then apologetics is basically the defense of why we believe what we believe. So First Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." And so this is kind of the foundation for apologetics, is being able to give a logical, reasoned response to why we believe and not just say, well, you just have to have faith. Like there is evidence out there, and that is what apologetics focuses on logic and reason, and that the scientific thinking person that really has to have evidence, we can't just take it on faith. That is what apologetics does. So we don't have to be ashamed of this. God already knows all of our doubts, all of our questions. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But when I first heard about apologetics, and there are all kinds of books out there, I was like, well, I want to read some of these books. So I ordered a couple off of Amazon. And within a couple of days, so this is probably 3 days after I prayed that prayer, I got my first Amazon book, and it was The Knowledge of God in the Word and the World by Dr. Douglas Grutis and Dr. Andrew Ike Shepherdson. And so I was reading on the back cover about these two authors and saw that Dr. Shepherdson was the head of the Masters in Christian Apologetics program at Colorado Christian University. And I was like, wait, you can get a master's in this? And so I immediately went to the desk and I pulled up the computer. And sure enough, there's a master's in Christian apologetics that teaches you the science, the logic, the reasoning, the historical evidence, archaeological evidence, all the data that we have to show how Christianity is real and true and believable and not just a made up bunch of nonsense. And so I was sold. I was like, all right, God, clearly this is where you want me to go, like just one thing after another after another. And so within the week, I was signed up to get my master's. And I have to tell this other little part of the story, which doesn't have anything to do with doubt, but it's just such a God miracle that I want to share. Okay, so a master's program, postgraduate, education. And so I was praying, God, I don't really know how I'm going to pay for this, so I need your help. Well, let me back up a few. When I started my business, All Medical, in 2018, God told me that He wanted a bank account, and 10% off the top came off and went into His bank account. That was His. And then He would tell me what to do with that money. And every so often He would tell me, oh, we'll give it to this person, give it to this church, do this with it, donate to this, organization. So I would hear and I would fulfill that. Then like 18 months and nothing. And I was praying about it. I was like, God, I'm getting quite the figure in this bank account. Like, I need to know what I'm supposed to be doing with this. Nothing. Hold on to it. I don't want anything done with it just yet. Okay. And so over about 18 months, it kept accumulating. And I'm like, God, what am I supposed to do with this? And so when I prayed, God, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. I need your help. He said, that bank account that's been gathering money for the last few months? It's like, that is to pay for this education because I'm calling you to this and I'm providing for you. And I was like, are you serious? Like, He had saved that money for me. And it was within $1,000 of what I needed. Like, I had an extra $1,000 left over, which covered books and things that I needed. So, I mean, it was the exact amount that I needed for this program. So, I mean, very clearly, this was where He wanted me to be. So there are a few things that I learned from my 10 months of struggle and the learning that came as a result of that. And I want to share that with you. So the definitions that we use are important. So I want to take a few minutes to go over belief, doubt, faith, and certainty. So belief is to be persuaded, persuading oneself, usually with evidence. Okay, that's the definition of belief. Belief is a choice of free will. Another definition is to trust something as true based on the examination of evidence. So belief usually denotes some necessity of proof. Belief is a yes or no proposition. It's you either believe something is true or you do not believe something is true. So to believe is to be in one mind about trusting someone or something as true. Unbelief then can be defined as being in one mind about rejecting a belief. So if religious doubt is being of two minds or undecided about the nature of God, and unbelief is being of one mind about rejecting God, then they cannot be the same thing. So the opposite of belief is not doubt, because you can't have gradients of belief. You either do or you do not believe. So the opposite of belief is unbelief. It's not doubt. Doubt is to call something into question, to call into question the truth of, to distrust, or to lack confidence in. So notice that it calls into question and distrust is not unbelief, but rather an indecision. So we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So to doubt is to be in two minds about something, which is wavering between one position or the other. And Os Guinness does a really great job of explaining doubt in his book called God in the Dark. So this is where I'm getting some of this information from, and I'll link that in the show notes. And he defines it as being in two minds about something, wavering between one position or another. He says the heart of doubt is a divided heart. And doubt can produce a stronger faith by successfully dealing with uncertainty. Paul Thagard states that doubt arises from external statements, claims, or teachings that are at odds with the beliefs held by an individual. So he defines religious doubt as being of two minds on the nature of God, or a believer who lacks assurance. And again, anybody that I'm quoting, I will have the bibliography citation in the show notes so that you can look that up and reference that and have some resources to dig into this a little bit deeper if you want to. So doubt is not the opposite of faith, nor is it the same as unbelief. Gary Habermas states, not all states of doubt are created equal. Even in scripture, it's not always rebuked. So we're going to talk a little bit about a biblical picture of doubt and when it's accepted and when it's actually encouraged and praised by Jesus as a way of growing closer to Him as we start to question things and get to know Him better and more deeply. All right, so then we have the definition of faith. So faith is defined as the act of believing, faith as an action, or a gift from God. Romans 12:3 says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So there are some of us who are given an unquestioning, unwavering faith. We don't need evidence. We don't need any kind of logic or reasoning. All we need is the gift that God gave us, and we hold steady and fast to that, and we are able to just move forward and we're good to go. And then there are others of us, and I am in this camp, where we haven't been given that level of faith and we need to work harder at it. And I needed to dig deeper. I needed to find the answers to my questions. I needed to pursue that relationship intentionally in order to resolve my answers or my questions. So when we're looking at faith and belief, they're very closely tied. Belief is a choice of free will, a yes or no proposition, while faith is a gift of God and has a component of action included. So faith is on a spectrum of weak to strong, depending on what God is providing us at the time. And so we can fluctuate a little bit in how strong our faith is to how much we are actively pursuing. For many, many years leading up to my year of doubt, I can say that I wasn't really super active in pursuing him or being very proactive in answering my questions. So they just sat there for probably 20, 30 years. And then I found a church. I was engaged in, learning and growing, and I was learning so much. And that's when it hit me, which is very weird timing, in my opinion. But now I look back at it and I wonder how much of that was a spiritual attack that was preparing me for this calling of stepping into this program. So God uses all kinds of things. He even uses doubt to allow us to move forward in our faith. So the last definition we want to look at is certainty. So this is undoubted truth or confidence. That's the definition of certainty, assurance, incapable of failing. So when we look at, that's also a yes or no proposition. You are either certain or you are not certain. You can't be kind of certain because then you're not certain, right? So doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is the opposite of certainty. So you can still be uncertain and believe. I'm uncertain about a lot of things, yet I still believe. The opposite of faith is not doubt, but mistrust. When we don't trust God, we have very little faith. And the opposite of belief is unbelief. So you either believe or you don't, right? You're either certain or you doubt. So many people and blogs online, including popular religious websites, I won't name names, but they all claim that the opposite of faith is doubt. And doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is the opposite of certainty. So this is very important to get clear. You can still very much believe in Jesus, but can doubt that he rose from the dead or was able to perform miracles. Okay, that doesn't mean you don't believe it. It means that you doubt. You have questions about it. You're not certain how this works. And you need a little bit more evidence or logic or reasoning or whatever. It doesn't mean you don't believe in Jesus. You just don't understand how this works. So the stronger the doubt, the weaker the faith, it is true, but they are not mutually exclusive. And so as we ask our doubtful questions, as we ask these questions, as we get answers to them and those doubts resolve, our faith grows as a result of that. So you can look at doubt not as something to be ashamed of and hide because it makes you a bad Christian. What it means is that you are growing and you are starting to ask deeper questions because you want to understand God. You want to understand the nature of God. You want to understand how all of this works. And so you're asking the questions that we should all be encouraging each other to ask. And we'll take a look at some of the research and how our unexpressed or unanswered doubts will impact our physical health. What the research shows is that suppressed doubts over a long period of time will increase our stress and anxiety levels. And so this actually has physical consequences for our health as well. So faith involves belief in things for which we have no external evidence. Hebrews 11, 1 through 3 talks about this. But faith is an act of trust in God, even without evidence. And so Hebrews 1 and 3 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." So the theme of doubting Jesus and strong faith are in direct opposition is not necessarily true. Doubt is a stepping stone in the growth of faith. I can't stress that enough. I think that's really important. So genuine faith is unreserved in its commitments. Christian faith is the belief that God is a person with whom we can develop a relationship. He is a being of complete truth and total trustworthiness. So this is a quote from God in the Dark by Osgoodness, as I mentioned earlier. So faith in God is dynamic. We are either growing in our relationship with him or we're moving away from him. And as with any relationship, you can kind of think of it like use it or lose it. If you're not putting effort into it, if it's not growing, then it's most likely shrinking, right? And so we have that responsibility as children of God to move forward in our relationship with him and prioritize him. So God does not assign belief. That is our free choice to make based on the evidence that we have available to us. The rest is on faith, and faith is a gift of God. So we can look at it as both a combination of his gift and our choice to believe him. So our faith involves stepping towards Jesus in trust, and we have to take that step first, that we have to choose to believe God's response to our stepping forward and saying, I believe. So our tools are prayer, fellowship, studying scripture, historical and scientific evidence that allow us to build our confidence in our beliefs, and talking with other believers about how they've worked through their own doubts if they're willing to share. So God invites our questions. He knows our doubts. We admit them to what we're thinking, what our questions are, and he wants us to pursue those answers. We don't have to be afraid of doing that. We don't have to be afraid like, oh, well, if I, what if I start to investigate this and I find that it's actually not true? That is absolutely something. That is a doubt that needs to be addressed, because there should be no fear around getting answers to your doubts if God is true. If he's not true, wouldn't you want to know the truth about that? But the thing is that he is true. And so the more you look for evidence for him, the more you find it. And Jeremiah, it's written in the book of Jeremiah that if you seek me with all your heart, you will find me. I butchered the quote, but that's basically what he says. If you seek me, you will find me. So, and I love Isaiah 118. The first part of that verse is, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. So he's telling us, I'm not something that's just some made up thing that won't withstand questions. Like you can come with your questions and your reasons and your need for logic, and let's reason together. Let's work this out. So he invites us into that. He wants us to pursue those answers. So one thing that I love are the stories about doubters in the Bible itself. One of the verses that I held on to so tightly during my year of doubt is Mark 9:24. So this is the man who brought his son who was possessed by a spirit that makes him mute and caused him to have seizures. So this is found in Mark 9, verses 17 through 25. And so I'll just read a couple of highlights from it. So the man comes up and he talks to Jesus and he says that he wants him to try to cast him out. He brought him to the apostles. The apostles, well, I guess at that point it was the disciples. The disciples couldn't cast him out. So he came to Jesus directly. And Jesus asked how long it had been happening. And he said, from childhood. So this is verse 22. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And what did Jesus do? He rebuked the unclean spirit, made him come out, and the child was healed. And so this is just such a good, strong example that Jesus responds to our doubts and our attempts to continue to pursue him. This man wasn't sure if Jesus could do it, but he had faith that if he could, he would have. And so he brought the child to him. And Jesus's response is that if you can, all things are possible. And the man responds honestly and says, I believe, help my unbelief. Right. And so he definitely had doubts, but he wanted to believe. And Jesus knows our hearts. He knows that we want to pursue him and have a relationship with him, but that we struggle, and he's not insensitive to that. In fact, Jesus himself even has some episodes of questioning where God is. So Matthew 27:46. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I skipped the Hebrew part because I can't pronounce that. But Why have you forsaken me? So he's asking, where are you? You're not with me anymore, right? This was the time that God turned his back on the sins that Jesus was taking. And this was Jesus's experience of not feeling God. Probably, my guess is for the first time in his life. He felt abandoned. He felt like where God turned his face from him. Where are you, God? So Jesus himself was asking these questions, right? And so that tells us it's not a sin. It's not a sin to ask questions about God, to ask him where he is, to find out, to pursue him and to try to discover where he's at. And then, of course, we've got Doubting Thomas, where he said he wasn't going to believe until he could actually feel the holes in Jesus's hand inside. So there are multiple examples of doubt in the Bible, which should give us great comfort. And look at the Psalms. There are so many Psalms about, doubts and anger at God and all of the sadness and the travails that we go through. So the Psalms are just rife with questions and wrestling with things that we don't quite understand and that we're seeking answers to. So and I just love that he's included that in his word so that we know that we're not alone, right? This is not unprecedented. This is not unusual. This is, David, after the Lord's own heart, the man after the Lord's own heart, has questions about God and why God allows things to happen, and the pain that he feels, and all of that. So let's talk about how our doubts actually affect our physical health. So when I was in that year, I wasn't sleeping very well. My nervous system felt like it was kind of on edge. I had a lot of tension. There was brain fog and fatigue that came along. So there was this weird shift in my physical health that no rest, nothing else seemed to really fix. It was just an unsettled, unhappy feeling, right? And it was that tension, that battle of my mind versus my heart. So our spiritual health, our spiritual doubt doesn't just affect our mental health. It shows up in the body. So we can try to suppress those questions, but it won't disappear. We have to address those questions. So there are some studies that show the physical effects that we have of what are termed religious struggles. So these are our questions, our doubts about God, things that are unanswered and unresolved. So when left unaddressed, doubts can negatively impact our mental and physical well-being. So studies show that unaddressed doubts can lead to depression and other health problems, can lead to feelings of isolation and discouragement, can cause increased cortisol levels, increased cardiovascular risks. We see worsening immune function and increased rates of autoimmune disease. So there is a lot of research about how our doubts can negatively impact our physical health. The key piece here is our unresolved or unaddressed doubts. So we can have these doubts, and the longer they go unanswered and unpursued, the more impact they will have because of the stress that we feel, the stress like I did in 2023, the stress that I felt between wanting to believe and struggling with some of these questions that was starting to affect my faith, which is a very stressful thing. So our body physically responds with stress symptoms, with our sleep, with our blood sugar levels, with blood pressure levels. All kinds of potential negative side effects that then can be carried through and shown in the research that we have around this topic of how our doubts can negatively impact our physical health. So I think the topic of religious doubt is too important to shortchange. This episode ended up being almost an hour long, so I decided to break it up into 2 episodes. So next week, we'll talk about how to identify the types of doubts we have, how each type can affect our physical and emotional health, and what we can do to answer our questions and resolve any doubts we have so that they don't become a block to our healing. Until next week. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please subscribe for more topics like this, where we focus on bringing our faith and health together for a whole you. If you have questions around your health or your faith, including doubts and struggles with what you've been taught about God, we'd love to have you send us an email at support@psalmmedical.com.